When we imagine the Victorian era, we often think of tall townhouses with iron railings, flickering gas lamps, and children dressed in stiff little outfits. But behind those lace curtains and polished brass doorknobs, the daily rhythm of family life was very different from what we know today. Parenting, in particular, was guided by principles that might shock us now. What was considered good parenting in the 19th century would, in many cases, be regarded as neglect, abuse, or even a crime in the 21st century. To understand why, we must first step into the Victorian home. The reign of Queen Victoria lasted from 1837 to 1901. It was a period of rapid industrialization, of strict moral codes, and of clear social hierarchies. The family was often described as a little kingdom, and the father was its king. Children were expected to obey without question, and mothers carried the burden of shaping their offspring's morals and manners. The Victorian idea of childhood was not the same as ours. Today, we speak of children as innocent, playful, and full of curiosity. In contrast, Victorians often saw children as little adults. They were believed to be naturally sinful, prone to laziness, and in need of constant correction. To let a child be a child would have been, in their eyes, irresponsible. To allow too much freedom was to risk raising someone unruly, or worse, immoral. Inside the home, strict order was maintained. The father rarely spent much time with the children. His role was to provide for the household and to serve as the final authority in matters of discipline. If a child misbehaved, it was not uncommon for the mother to threaten, "Wait until your father gets home." This phrase carried with it the weight of real fear. The father's punishments might involve caning, whipping, or extended periods of silence and shame. What we would now call abuse was simply called discipline. The mother's role was more complicated. She was expected to be loving, but never indulgent. Victorian mothers were told not to cuddle their babies too much, lest the child become spoiled. Advice manuals urged restraint, teaching women that showing too much affection would create weakness. A mother's duty was to train her child in manners, prayer, and household order. Even the design of the Victorian home reflected these values. Parlors were formal, meant for receiving guests, and children were often not allowed to linger there. The dining room had strict rules. Children ate what was given to them in silence and were dismissed quickly. Bedrooms were sparse with little decoration, and privacy was almost non-existent. Children often shared beds, and personal space was a luxury reserved for adults. For working-class families, the picture was even harsher. Crowded housing meant children grew up in noisy, dirty, and dangerous conditions. Parents worked long hours in factories, leaving children to fend for themselves or to work alongside them. Babies might be left with older siblings barely out of toddlerhood themselves. Neglect was not only common, it was often unavoidable. The middle and upper classes, though wealthier, were not necessarily gentler. In wealthy households, children were frequently raised by governesses, nurses, or servants. Parents sometimes saw their own children only for brief, formal encounters each day. Affection was delegated to hired caregivers, while mothers and fathers maintained a distant dignity. This emotional gap was considered normal. A child was not a companion. A child was a project. Education, too, was part of the Victorian parenting philosophy. Even at home, learning was strict. Boys were prepared for careers or university, while girls were taught music, sewing, and moral instruction. Punishment was part of the learning process. Mistakes in reading, writing, or posture could lead to a smack on the hands or hours of writing lines. It is important to note that these practices were not usually seen as cruel by those who used them. They were believed to be necessary for raising upright citizens. The Industrial Revolution demanded discipline, punctuality, and obedience. Families passed these values on through parenting, believing they were giving their children the best chance in life. But by today's standards, many of these practices would violate laws protecting children. Modern parenting emphasizes nurture, protection, and the psychological well-being of the child. Victorian parenting, by contrast, valued obedience, productivity, and moral correction. What we see now as harmful, they saw as essential. Imagine for a moment a Victorian child sitting at the dinner table. The room is dimly lit by a gas lamp. The table is set with heavy silverware and a stiff white cloth. The father sits at the head, silent, while the mother watches carefully. The child must sit upright, hands folded, eyes lowered. If he fidgets, if he spills, or if he dares to speak without being spoken to, punishment will come swiftly. For the parents, this is not cruelty. It is love expressed through order. For us, it is an unsettling reminder of how much parenting has changed. This was the Victorian home, a place of hierarchy, silence, and discipline. A place where childhood was brief, affection was limited, and obedience was everything. To begin our journey through Victorian parenting, we must first accept that their values were deeply different from ours. What was once considered good parenting is, to us, a portrait of cruelty. In the chapters to come, we will explore these practices in detail, from corporal punishment to child labor, and see why, if practiced today, Victorian parenting would indeed be illegal. When we think of children today, we picture laughter, play, and innocence. Childhood is widely seen as a protected time, a period for learning, exploration, and growth before the burdens of adulthood arrive. But in the Victorian age, that separation was far less clear. To Victorians, children were not thought of as fragile dreamers who needed years of shelter. They were simply younger versions of adults, expected to behave, to work, and to carry themselves with discipline. Childhood, in many ways, was not a stage to be treasured, but a problem to be managed. The roots of this idea came from both religion and necessity. In Christian teaching, widely influential during the 19th century, children were believed to be born with original sin. They were not considered naturally innocent, but naturally flawed. A child's role, therefore, was to be trained, corrected, and guided firmly toward righteousness. Innocence was not something to be protected. It was something to be earned through strict discipline and obedience. This belief meant that the moment a child could walk, speak, or work, society expected them to contribute. Parents did not imagine long years of carefree play. Instead, they saw small workers, small helpers, and small learners. A 5-year-old might already be working in a factory or a mine. A 10-year-old might be responsible for the care of younger siblings. A teenager, especially a girl, might already be preparing for marriage. Childhood was simply a shorter apprenticeship for the adult life ahead. This attitude shaped even the way children dressed. Today, we are used to bright colors, playful fabrics, and clothing that signals youth. In Victorian times, children often wore miniature versions of adult outfits. Boys might wear suits, waistcoats, and stiff collars. Girls wore long dresses, petticoats, and lace, sometimes so restrictive that play was nearly impossible. Clothing sent a clear message. Children were not meant to look or act childish. They were meant to appear orderly, respectable, and ready to enter adult society at any moment. Play itself was viewed with suspicion. The idea of toys as instruments of fun was still developing. Many toys were designed to teach lessons or prepare children for adult roles. A toy sewing kit for a girl was not meant for amusement. It was training for her domestic duties. A toy soldier for a boy was not merely entertainment. It was preparation for discipline, patriotism, and perhaps military service. Too much laughter, noise, or idleness was frowned upon. To be childlike, in the modern sense, was to be dangerously close to being unruly. In working-class families, this approach was driven by survival. Parents simply could not afford to treat children as dependents for long. A child's wages, however small, might be the difference between having bread on the table or going hungry. Parents encouraged, and sometimes forced, their children into labor as soon as possible. Chimney sweeping, factory work, or street vending were common paths. The line between childhood and adulthood blurred, not because parents were unloving, but because poverty left them no choice. In wealthier households, the reasoning was different but led to the same result. Even if children did not need to work for survival, they were still expected to carry themselves with adult dignity. Education was strict, schedules were rigid, and time was structured. A young boy in an upper-class home might be sent to boarding school by the age of 7, where his days were filled with lessons and discipline. A young girl might be taught to play piano, sew, and read moral tales, all while being reminded that her future role was to manage a household and raise her own children. Childhood was not a playground, it was preparation. This outlook also affected the way Victorians spoke to children. Today, parents often encourage curiosity, asking children to share their thoughts and feelings. In Victorian households, conversation was tightly controlled. A child might be present at the dinner table, but they were rarely invited to speak. Children should be seen and not heard was more than a saying. It was a rule. To speak out of turn was to risk punishment, sometimes harsh. Silence, obedience, and respect were considered more important than expression, imagination, or joy. The emotional cost of this system was significant. Many children grew up without hearing words of affection from their parents. Hugs and kisses were scarce. Fathers, especially, were often distant figures, providers, disciplinarians, but rarely companions. Mothers, though closer to their children, were urged not to indulge them with softness. Advice books warned women against rocking babies too much or responding too quickly to their cries. To comfort a child, they believed, was to encourage weakness. And yet, despite this cold exterior, Victorian parents did love their children in their own way. They measured love differently, through teaching, correcting, and preparing their offspring for the hard realities of life. To them, to shield a child from hardship was to set them up for failure. To us, however, their methods feel stern, even cruel. Consider a 10-year-old boy in 1850. He wakes before dawn, dresses in a stiff collar and jacket, and walks several miles to a factory. His hands are small enough to clean the inside of machines, which makes him valuable to the employer. His parents remind him to be strong, not to cry, and to do his duty. By evening, he returns home exhausted, eats a simple meal in silence, and goes to bed early, ready to repeat the same routine tomorrow. He is still a child in years, but in every other way he lives like an adult. Or imagine a wealthy girl of the same age. She sits in a parlor with a governess, learning to embroider. Her dress is uncomfortable, her back must remain straight, and her mistakes are corrected sharply. She practices piano for an hour, then copies passages from the Bible. She will never enter a factory, but her day is no less structured and demanding. She too is being trained for her adult role. In both cases, the child's world is shaped by adult expectations. The joy, freedom, and emotional care that we associate with childhood today were largely absent. Childhood was not an end in itself. It was a brief waiting room before the doors of adult responsibility opened, often far too soon. As we look back, it becomes clear why such practices would be seen as harmful today. Modern child development recognizes the importance of play, affection, and emotional support. Laws protect children. If there is one feature of Victorian parenting that stands out most sharply against modern ideas, it is the use of corporal punishment. In the 19th century, physical discipline was not merely tolerated, it was considered essential. The guiding belief of the age was simple: spare the rod, spoil the child. To raise a child without punishment was, in many eyes, to invite ruin. Today, such practices would be considered abuse, and in many countries they are outright illegal. But in the Victorian household, they were part of the daily rhythm of family life. The Victorian philosophy of discipline was rooted in both religion and tradition. The Bible was often quoted to justify the striking of children, especially passages from the book of Proverbs. Parents believed that children were naturally prone to sin and disobedience, and that the best way to correct them was through physical pain. The logic was straightforward. If a child associated misbehavior with suffering, he or she would be less likely to repeat it. The instruments of punishment were varied and familiar. The cane, the belt, and the whip were common in wealthier homes. Working-class families who could not afford such formal tools used whatever was at hand: a switch from the garden, a slipper, or a wooden spoon. Some parents kept a specific object: a leather strap, a thin rod, or a stout stick, hung in plain sight as a constant reminder of authority. To see the rod hanging on the wall was to live with the knowledge that punishment was always near. Punishments were delivered for a wide range of offenses. Talking back to a parent, spilling food at the table, failing to complete chores, or even showing too much energy could result in a beating. For children of stricter households, the list of possible faults was nearly endless. Poor posture, untidy clothing, or a lack of respect in tone. A child who spoke out of turn at dinner might be whipped afterward. A child who failed to memorize a Bible verse might receive a caning. It is important to understand that, to Victorian parents, such punishments were not usually seen as cruel. They were viewed as corrective. To them, a child who feared punishment was a child who learned discipline, respect, and obedience. To refrain from punishing was, in their view, a form of neglect. A parent who spared the rod was not considered gentle, but irresponsible. The ritual of punishment itself often carried its own gravity. A father might call a child into his study, closing the heavy wooden door behind them. The child, trembling, would be told to explain their misbehavior. After a short lecture, the punishment would be administered. Sometimes the child was required to thank the father afterward, a practice meant to teach humility and gratitude for correction. Mothers, too, punished, though their methods were often less formal. A sharp smack across the face, a slap on the hand, or a twist of the ear were common ways of asserting control. For many children, the anticipation of punishment was as harsh as the punishment itself. Knowing that every mistake might lead to pain created a constant atmosphere of fear. The phrase, "wait until your father gets home," carried a chilling weight. Hours might pass before the punishment, but the dread was itself part of the discipline. Some households went beyond beatings into more severe methods. A child might be locked in a dark room for hours, denied food, or forced to kneel on hard stone floors as a form of penance. Cold baths, designed to shock the body into obedience, were sometimes used. These harsher punishments blurred the line between correction and cruelty. Yet even these practices, in many cases, were defended as acts of love. Of course, not every Victorian home was equally strict. Some parents, influenced by emerging new ideas about child rearing, avoided excessive punishment. Writers such as Charles Dickens highlighted the cruelty of harsh discipline, and reformers slowly began to argue for more compassion in parenting. But these voices were exceptions, not the rule. The overwhelming majority of families, across class lines, used corporal punishment as their primary tool of control. The effects of this system were long-lasting. Children grew up learning to hide their emotions, to remain silent in the presence of authority, and to associate love with fear. The scars of punishment were not always physical. The emotional distance between parents and children was widened by a relationship built on pain and obedience rather than comfort and trust. By modern standards, these practices would be condemned. Today, in many parts of the world, striking a child with a cane, whip, or belt would be considered abuse and could result in legal action. In the United States, while corporal punishment is still technically legal in some homes, social services often intervene if physical discipline leaves marks or injuries. In schools, such punishments have been banned in most states. In Europe, many countries have outlawed corporal punishment in all settings, even at home. To a Victorian parent, this modern view would have seemed astonishing, even dangerous. To them, a child raised without fear of the rod was a child doomed to disrespect and disorder. The persistence of corporal punishment in Victorian society reminds us how differently past generations understood children. Where we see vulnerability, they saw sinfulness. Where we value nurture, they valued discipline. Where we draw the line at harm, they blurred the line in the name of love. To picture this world, imagine again the Victorian dining room. A boy spills his cup of milk, and the tablecloth stains. The father, stern and silent, rises from his chair. The boy is marched to another room, where the cane awaits. A few strokes across his legs bring tears to his eyes. He returns to the table, silent, ashamed, and careful not to spill again. For the parents, this is a lesson well taught. For us, it is a disturbing scene. In the chapters ahead, we will see that discipline did not end at the household door. Schools, workplaces, and even religious institutions continued the same philosophy, ensuring that children lived under constant watch and correction. But the roots of Victorian control lay in the home, in the cane, the rod, and the belief that pain was the surest path to virtue. In the Victorian home, parenting was not simply a shared task between two equals. The roles of mothers and fathers were sharply defined, shaped by both tradition and the strict gender expectations of the era. Each parent was expected to fulfill a particular duty in raising children, and those duties reflected the wider structure of society itself. To understand Victorian parenting, we must look closely at this division of authority, where the father was the stern ruler of the household, and the mother, though nurturing, was bound to a role of moral instruction and obedience herself. The Victorian family was often described as a miniature monarchy. The father, like a king, held ultimate power. He was the provider, the protector, and above all, the disciplinarian. His word was final, his authority unquestioned. Within the walls of the home, he represented law and order. To defy him was to invite punishment, both for the child and sometimes for the wife. Fathers were not expected to spend much time in direct interaction with their children, but when they did, it was often in the form of correction or command. The very structure of Victorian society reinforced this view. Men dominated the workforce, held political power, and were considered rational and strong. Women, in contrast, were seen as emotional, delicate, and suited for the private world of the home. This ideology, sometimes referred to as the separate spheres, placed men in the public sphere of work and politics, and women in the private sphere of family and morality. Parenting, therefore, was split along these lines. Mothers carried the weight of daily child rearing. They oversaw meals, hygiene, education, and manners. They taught children how to pray, how to behave in public, and how to perform their expected social roles. But their work was guided by the shadow of the father's authority. If a child misbehaved, it was often the mother who warned, "Wait until your father gets home." Her role was to prepare the child, but his role was to enforce the law. This created a paradox for Victorian children. The mother was present every day, caring and instructing, but she could not always offer comfort. Manuals and advice books of the time urged mothers not to indulge their children with affection. Too much hugging or soothing, they were told, would spoil the child and weaken their character. A good mother was strict yet loving, present yet restrained. Her responsibility was not to protect the child from pain, but to prepare them for it. The father's authority, though less frequent in its presence, carried enormous weight. A child might rarely speak with him directly, but when he did, it was with trembling respect. Many Victorian memoirs describe fathers as distant figures, to be feared more than loved. His arrival home at the end of the day often shifted the entire mood of the household. Children sat straighter, lowered their voices, and behaved with rigid formality. In some homes, children stood when the father entered the room, as though in the presence of a superior. The mother's role as moral guide also extended into the spiritual realm. Victorian Christianity emphasized sin, duty, and eternal salvation. Mothers were tasked with teaching their children prayers, Bible verses, and hymns. They were told to instill piety, modesty, and self-control. A child who lied, stole, or disobeyed was not only a disappointment to the family, but a threat to their own soul. Mothers were expected to remind their children of this constantly, tying every act of misbehavior to eternal consequences. For daughters, the mother's influence was especially significant. Girls were raised to follow their mother's example, preparing for a life of domestic service to their own future families. They were taught cooking, sewing, and the maintenance of a household. They were also instructed in modesty, obedience, and feminine decorum. A daughter who showed too much independence or defiance risked not only punishment, but also damage to her marriage prospects. For sons, the father's example loomed large. Boys were taught to be strong, silent, and dutiful. They were reminded that one day they would be heads of households themselves, and thus must learn discipline early. If a boy showed weakness, it was corrected quickly. If he showed disobedience, it was punished severely. Affection was often withheld in the name of building character. The imbalance of authority also meant that mothers, though essential, were themselves treated as subordinate to fathers. A wife was expected to obey her husband, just as children were expected to obey their parents. In this way, the structure of the household mirrored the structure of society at large, men at the top, women and children beneath. Parenting was not simply about raising children, it was about reinforcing the social order. Not all families conformed perfectly to this model, of course. Some fathers were gentle and affectionate, and some mothers ignored the advice to withhold comfort. But the dominant cultural expectation was clear. Fathers commanded, mothers guided, and children obeyed. Any deviation from this structure was often met with criticism, gossip, or social disapproval. Looking at this system today, it is easy to see why so much of it would be considered harmful or even illegal. The father's near absolute authority left little room for children's voices or rights. The mother's restrained affection deprived children of the comfort we now know to be essential for healthy development. And the overall imbalance of power reinforced patterns of domination and submission that modern parenting seeks to dismantle. Imagine again the Victorian household in the evening. The mother is helping the children recite their lessons by the fire. The door opens and the father steps in. Instantly, the room falls quiet. The children sit upright, their eyes lowered. The mother nods respectfully and the father surveys the scene. If the lessons are incomplete, or if misbehavior has occurred during the day, punishment may follow. The children know it, the mother knows it, and the father expects it. This ritual of authority is as much about order as it is about love. In the chapters ahead, we will see how this structure extended beyond the household. For the poorest families, the authority of parents often gave way to the authority of workhouses, where children labored under the control of strangers. Parenting itself, in those cases, was shaped as much by poverty as by tradition. But within the home, the division of mothers and fathers into strict roles was one of the defining features of Victorian parenting. A feature that would raise alarm and even legal intervention in our own time. If middle and upper-class Victorian families raised their children with stern discipline and distant affection, the reality for poor families was far harsher. Poverty shaped every aspect of parenting, often stripping parents of the ability to provide even the most basic care. In many cases, raising children under such conditions was less about nurturing and more about sheer survival. Nowhere is this more evident than in the workhouse system, where families driven by desperation sought refuge, but found a life of hardship, fear, and broken bonds. The workhouse was, in theory, a safety net. Established under the Poor Law Amendment Act of 1834, workhouses were meant to provide food, shelter, and work for those unable to survive on their own. But in practice, they were designed to be deliberately unpleasant. Lawmakers believed that charity should never be comfortable. Otherwise, too many people would rely on it. The workhouse, therefore, was a place of last resort, dreaded by the poor and spoken of in whispers. For many families, entering a workhouse was not only a sign of failure, but also the beginning of separation from one another. When a family crossed the threshold of a workhouse, they were immediately divided. Husbands and wives were placed in separate quarters, often unable to see each other except under strict supervision. Children were also separated by age and gender, sometimes torn from their mother's arms. The unity of the family, already fragile under poverty, was deliberately broken. Parenting, in the sense of daily love and guidance, became nearly impossible under such rules. Mothers might know their children were somewhere in the same building, but might not see them for days or weeks at a time. Fathers often lost contact altogether. Inside the children's wards, life was grim. Meals were sparse, often consisting of gruel, bread, and occasionally a thin broth. Clothing was plain and scratchy, stripped of individuality. Toys were virtually non-existent. Discipline was strict and silence was demanded. The children were expected to work as soon as they were able, sweeping floors, assisting in kitchens, or performing menial labor. For older children, work outside the institution was often arranged. Parents had little say in where their sons and daughters were sent. This stripping away of parental authority was one of the most devastating aspects of the workhouse system. A mother or father might wish to protect their child, to offer comfort, or to guide them. But in the workhouse, those rights were denied. The state, through the workhouse, assumed the role of parent. And unlike even the sternest of Victorian mothers and fathers, the workhouse showed no affection at all. The stigma of the workhouse was also profound. Children who grew up there were often marked for life as paupers. Their clothing, their accents, and even their posture might betray their origins. Other children mocked them, and employers treated them with suspicion. For parents, the knowledge that their children would bear this stigma was a heavy burden. They entered the workhouse to save their children from starvation, but in doing so, they condemned them to a different kind of suffering. Outside the workhouse, poor families who managed to avoid it still faced conditions nearly as harsh. Parents worked long hours in factories, mines, or as servants, often leaving children unattended for most of the day. Infants were sometimes left in the care of slightly older siblings, barely old enough to manage themselves. Fires, accidents, and street dangers claimed many young lives, while parents labored to earn enough for rent and bread. Some parents, desperate for income, encouraged or forced their children to work alongside them. A small boy could be sent up a chimney to clean soot because his body was small enough to fit. A young girl might be sent into textile mills, where her fingers could tie threads that adults' hands could not. These were not acts of cruelty in the parents' eyes, but acts of survival. Yet to us, they are heartbreaking examples of how poverty robbed children of both safety and childhood. Even within their own homes, poor families often lacked the means to provide proper care. Rooms were cramped, sometimes housing entire families in a single damp cellar. Beds were shared and blankets were scarce. Food, when available, was simple and often insufficient. A crust of bread or a bowl of weak porridge might be all that a child received in a day. Illness spread quickly in such conditions, and with little access to medical care, many children died young. Parents grieved, but grief itself was muted by the harsh reality that another mouth to feed had been lost. It is important to remember that most parents in poverty loved their children deeply. Their harsh decisions, sending a child to work, placing them in a workhouse, or disciplining them with severity, were often driven by desperation, not cruelty. But the effect on the children was the same: a loss of affection, safety, and freedom. Parenting under these conditions was stripped down to the barest attempt at survival. By modern standards, the neglect experienced by these children would trigger intervention from social services. A parent today who left a toddler in the care of a 6-year-old or who sent their 10-year-old to work in dangerous conditions would likely face legal action. But in the Victorian age, these choices were seen as unavoidable. Society offered little help, and poverty forced parents into impossible decisions. The emotional toll on children raised in such environments cannot be overstated. Many grew up without a sense of security or stability. Their memories of childhood were not of games and comfort, but of hunger, fear, and labor. Some carried resentment toward their parents, while others understood that their parents had little choice. Either way, the bond between parent and child was strained by forces beyond their control. To picture the scene, imagine a mother leading her 3 children into a workhouse on a cold winter evening. Their clothes are thin, their stomachs empty. At the door, they are separated. The children cry as they are led away, their small hands reaching back toward her. She weeps, but cannot stop it. The rules are unbending. In that moment, her authority as a parent ends, replaced by the cold authority of the institution. She has chosen survival, but at the cost of her family's unity. In the next chapter, we will examine more closely how Victorian society blurred the line between work and childhood. For many children, labor was not just a way to support their families, it was presented as a form of education. But the lessons learned in coal mines and factories were not the lessons of books and play. They were the lessons of hardship, endurance, and exploitation. In the modern world, education is seen as the foundation of childhood. We imagine classrooms, teachers, and books as the proper environment for a young mind. But in Victorian Britain, millions of children received their education in a very different setting. Their classroom was the factory floor, the coal mine, or the city street. Their teachers were the overseers, foremen, and sometimes their own parents. Child labor was not merely tolerated, it was expected. And for many Victorians, it was defended as a kind of training for adult life. The roots of child labor lay partly in necessity. The Industrial Revolution created an enormous demand for cheap, flexible labor, and children fit this need perfectly. They were small enough to crawl under machines, quick enough to handle delicate tasks, and inexpensive enough to employ in large numbers. For poor families, a child's wages, however meager, could make the difference between survival and starvation. Parents did not always send their children to work because they wanted to. They sent them because they had no choice. But beyond necessity, there was also a prevailing belief that work itself was good for children. Victorian society prized discipline, obedience, and productivity. Work, it was thought, taught these values better than play. To send a child into a factory was, in the eyes of many, not simply a way to earn income, but a way to prepare them for adulthood. Work was a moral education. Idleness was seen as dangerous, even sinful. A child without labor, some argued, would grow into a useless or immoral adult. Factories, mills, and mines became the primary schools for countless Victorian children. A boy might learn to carry heavy loads in a coal mine, his small body forced into narrow tunnels filled with dust and darkness. A girl might learn to operate a loom in a textile mill, her fingers constantly at risk of being caught in the machinery. The hours were long, often 12 to 16 per day, 6 days a week. Breaks were few, meals were poor, and accidents were common. Yet parents often justified this suffering as part of growing up. The defenders of child labor often used the language of apprenticeship. Just as a boy in an earlier age might have been apprenticed to a blacksmith or carpenter, children in factories were said to be learning useful skills. But the truth was harsher. Most children performed repetitive, exhausting tasks that taught them little beyond endurance. The so-called education of child labor was an education in hardship, fatigue, and survival. Chimney sweeping is one of the most infamous examples. Boys as young as 5 were sent up narrow chimneys, their bodies scraped and bruised as they cleaned soot from the inside. Some suffocated, some burned, and many developed permanent injuries. Yet parents, desperate for income, allowed it, and employers defended it as useful training. It teaches them to be nimble, some said. In reality, it shortened their lives. Street labor was another form of this grim education. Children sold matches, shined shoes, or begged on corners, often under the watchful eyes of parents who depended on their earnings. These children learned to haggle, to endure insults, and to navigate dangerous streets. They were not taught letters and numbers in a classroom, they were taught survival in the open air. Their childhood lessons were those of hunger, competition, and endurance. In wealthier households, the philosophy was less brutal but carried the same spirit. Upper-class boys were often sent to boarding schools where strict schedules, harsh discipline, and endless tasks filled their days. The work was academic rather than physical, but the principle was the same: discipline through toil. Girls, meanwhile, were trained in household management, sewing, and social etiquette, preparing them for their adult roles as wives and mothers. Even for the wealthy, play was secondary to preparation. The defenders of this system often pointed to success stories. A child who worked in a factory and later became a foreman was held up as proof that labor built character. A boy who started sweeping chimneys and later joined the army was said to have gained resilience from his early struggles. But for every such story, there were countless others of children maimed, stunted, or dead before reaching adulthood. The price of this so-called education was too high. Some reformers recognized the cruelty of the system. Writers like Charles Dickens, in novels such as Oliver Twist and David Copperfield, drew attention to the suffering of working children. Campaigners pushed for laws to limit child labor and to provide some access to schooling. Over time, reforms did come. The Factory Acts of the 19th century gradually reduced the hours children could work and raised the minimum age for employment. But for much of the Victorian era, millions of children still spent their youth in toil. By today's standards, the idea of child labor as education seems absurd, even monstrous. We now understand that childhood is a critical period for learning, growth, and play. Laws around the world forbid children from working in dangerous or exploitative jobs. Parents who force their children into such labor today would likely face charges of abuse or neglect. Schools, not factories, are seen as the proper place for young minds. To picture this Victorian world, imagine a boy of 8 in a textile mill. The air is thick with lint, the clatter of machines is deafening, and his small fingers bleed from tying threads. His back aches, his stomach growls, and the overseer's cane looms nearby. At home, his mother tells him to be grateful for the work. It keeps bread on the table. To her, this is education. To us, it is exploitation. Or imagine a girl of 7 climbing into a chimney, her body squeezed into the black tunnel, coughing as soot fills her lungs. She emerges with burns and scratches, handed a crust of bread for her trouble. Her father pats her head and says she is learning to be strong. This, too, was called education. Today, it would be called abuse. The lesson of Victorian child labor is clear. What one age considers moral training, another recognizes as cruelty. The children of the 19th century were robbed of the protections and freedoms we now see as basic rights. Their parents, often complicit, sometimes helpless, participated in a system that blurred the line between survival and exploitation. In the next chapter, we will step into the Victorian schoolroom itself. For those children lucky enough to avoid full-time labor, education was still no gentle affair. Schools were run with the same principles as factories and homes: order, discipline, and the ever-present threat of the cane. For children who did not spend all their days in factories, fields, or workshops, the Victorian classroom was the other great training ground of the era. Education, like parenting, was guided by the principles of order, obedience, and moral instruction. Schools were not built to nurture creativity or curiosity. They were built to produce disciplined citizens, capable workers, and obedient subjects. To step into a Victorian schoolroom was to enter a world of silence, fear, and strict routine. A world that many modern parents would find shocking. At the start of the 19th century, education was not even universal. Wealthy families often hired governesses or sent their sons to private academies, while daughters were educated in accomplishments such as sewing, piano, and etiquette. Poor children had fewer opportunities. Some attended charity schools or Sunday schools run by churches, but many had no formal education at all. It was only as the century progressed through a series of education acts that schooling became more widespread. By the late Victorian period, children were increasingly required to attend school, at least for part of their youth. But the experience of school was not what we would recognize today. Classrooms were large, overcrowded, and often poorly ventilated. Wooden desks were arranged in rigid rows, with children sitting shoulder to shoulder. The teacher stood at the front, a figure of absolute authority, armed with chalk, textbooks, and frequently a cane. Lessons were conducted in a monotone, with endless repetition and memorization. Children were expected to recite passages word for word, often without understanding their meaning. To forget a line, stumble over a word, or mispronounce a phrase could invite immediate punishment. Discipline in schools was harsh, echoing the discipline of the Victorian household. Corporal punishment was not only common, but institutionalized. Teachers struck children with canes, rulers, or straps for talking out of turn. failing to complete assignments, or even for poor handwriting. Boys might be whipped across the hands or buttocks. Girls might be struck on the palms or knuckles. Some schools devised humiliating punishments, making a child stand in a corner wearing a dunce cap, or forcing them to kneel on hard floors for long periods. The aim was not only to correct mistakes, but to instill fear and submission. The philosophy behind this severity was the same as in the home. Educators believed that children were naturally lazy and disobedient, and that strict punishment was the only way to shape them into useful adults. A soft teacher was often criticized for failing to maintain order. To show kindness or leniency was seen as weakness. Just as parents were told not to indulge their children with affection, teachers were told not to indulge them with patience. The subjects taught reflected the values of the age. Reading, writing, and arithmetic were the foundations. Bible study was central, especially in church-run schools, where moral instruction often outweighed intellectual curiosity. In upper-class schools, boys studied Latin, Greek, history, and mathematics to prepare for university or professional life. Girls were trained in feminine skills, such as music, needlework, and French, designed to make them accomplished wives rather than independent thinkers. Critical thinking, creativity, and exploration were rarely encouraged. The goal was conformity. The daily schedule reinforced this discipline. School days were long, with few breaks. Silence was strictly enforced. Children sat still for hours, forbidden to fidget or whisper. Even recreation was limited, with physical activity often treated as another form of discipline, marching in lines, drilling with military precision, or performing structured exercises. Free play, so valued today, was often dismissed as frivolous or wasteful. For poor children, the conditions were even harsher. Ragged schools, set up for destitute families, were overcrowded and underfunded. Children often arrived hungry, dirty, and exhausted from work, making learning nearly impossible. Teachers, overwhelmed and underpaid, resorted to even stricter discipline to control their charges. A child who fell asleep in class after a 12-hour shift might be beaten for laziness rather than excused for exhaustion. Poverty was not an explanation, it was another offense. The emotional impact of this schooling was profound. Many children grew up associating learning with fear, pain, and humiliation. Instead of fostering curiosity, the system taught them to obey, to memorize, and to endure. For some, it created resilience, but for many, it stifled imagination and left lasting scars. A child beaten for poor handwriting might never pick up a pen with confidence again. A girl shamed for speaking out of turn might grow into a woman hesitant to use her voice. It is worth noting that not all Victorians agreed with this system. Reformers began to argue for kinder methods of teaching, inspired by new ideas about child development. Thinkers like Friedrich Froebel, who introduced the concept of kindergarten, emphasized play and creativity. Some progressive schools experimented with gentler approaches, but these were rare exceptions. The mainstream Victorian classroom remained a place of fear and formality. By modern standards, much of this would be considered abusive. Corporal punishment in schools is now banned in most Western countries. Teachers who struck students with canes or shamed them with dunce caps would lose their jobs and possibly face legal consequences. Education today emphasizes encouragement, support, and emotional well-being, alongside academic achievement. The idea of punishing a child for poor handwriting or for speaking out of turn feels archaic. And yet, for Victorian children, it was daily reality. To imagine this world, picture a schoolroom in 1860. The air is heavy with chalk dust. Dozens of children sit in stiff rows, their eyes fixed on the blackboard. The teacher's cane rests across his desk, a constant reminder of authority. A boy stumbles over his reading, his voice trembling. Without hesitation, the teacher strikes him across the knuckles. The boy winces, holds back tears, and continues reading. The lesson goes on, the room silent except for the drone of recitation. This is learning, Victorian style. The Victorian school was not only an institution of education, but also an extension of the family and the factory. It reinforced the same values: obedience, discipline, and endurance. Children were molded to accept authority without question, to perform tasks without complaint, and to suppress their own voices in favor of order. To us, this is a picture of cruelty disguised as education. To them, it was preparation for life. In the next chapter, if life was hard for Victorian children with parents, it was far worse for those without them. Orphans and abandoned children formed a visible, tragic presence on the streets of 19th century cities. They sold newspapers, begged for coins, or simply wandered hungry with no home to return to. Parenting in their case was either absent or replaced by institutions that provided little more than survival. These children lived on the margins of society, feared by some, pitied by others, and largely ignored by the system meant to protect them. The Victorian era was marked by high mortality rates, especially among the poor. Disease, accidents, and dangerous working conditions claimed countless adult lives, leaving many children without one or both parents. Mothers often died in childbirth, while fathers succumbed to workplace injuries or illness. When this happened, children could quickly find themselves destitute. Extended families sometimes stepped in, but not always. Poverty meant that relatives often lacked the means to take in another mouth to feed, and so many children slipped through the cracks. The streets of London, Manchester, and other industrial cities were crowded with these street Arabs, as they were sometimes called. Barefoot, dirty, and hungry, they lived by whatever means they could. Some sold matches, shoelaces, or newspapers. Others begged outside taverns or railway stations. A few turned to theft, pickpocketing from wealthy passers-by. Small gangs of children formed, sharing scraps of food and sleeping in alleys or under bridges. To the middle and upper classes, they were a disturbing sight, a reminder of poverty that most preferred to ignore. For some parents, abandonment was not a matter of choice, but of desperation. A mother unable to feed her child might leave them on the steps of a church or an orphanage, hoping they would at least be cared for there. Others left babies with baby farmers, women who took in infants for a fee, but often neglected or even killed them. Newspapers of the time reported horrifying cases of infant deaths linked to such arrangements. In these situations, parental love was overtaken by poverty and hopelessness, leaving children vulnerable to exploitation. Institutions for orphans did exist, but they were often grim. Workhouses, already harsh for families, were especially bleak for children without parents. Orphanages run by charities or churches sometimes provided food and shelter, but rarely affection. The focus was on discipline and moral instruction, not comfort. Children were dressed in identical uniforms, stripped of individuality, and subjected to strict routines. While these institutions may have saved many from starvation, they rarely offered the warmth or care that modern societies consider essential for child development. The emotional consequences were severe. Many orphans grew up with little sense of belonging, their identities shaped by neglect and survival. They learned to distrust authority, to rely only on themselves, and to suppress emotions that had no safe outlet. Affection was rare, encouragement rarer still. For them, childhood was not a protected stage of life, but a daily struggle to endure. Writers of the time, such as Charles Dickens, brought attention to these children through their works. Characters like Oliver Twist, the orphan who begged for more gruel in the workhouse, reflected real experiences. Dickens's stories shocked readers by exposing the cruelty and indifference faced by poor children. His novels did more than entertain. They forced society to confront the suffering it preferred to overlook. Reformers, inspired in part by such depictions, began to push for better conditions for orphans, leading eventually to changes in child welfare laws. Yet even with reforms, the reality remained harsh. For every child taken into a charitable home, many more remained on the streets. The sheer scale of poverty made it impossible for institutions to imagine this Victorian reality. Picture a boy of 9 standing barefoot in a foggy London street. His clothes are torn, his stomach empty. He holds a bundle of matches in his hand, calling out to passers-by. Most ignore him, A few toss him a coin, enough for bread but not enough for shelter. At night he curls up in a doorway, shivering, dreaming of warmth he may never know. This was his childhood, not a home, not a family, but the cold stones of the city. Or imagine a baby left at the door of an orphanage. The mother slips away in the dark, her heart breaking, but convinced this is her child's only chance. The infant is taken in, washed, and placed in a row of identical cribs. There is food, yes, and clothing, but no parent to whisper comfort, no familiar touch to soothe. The baby will grow, but always with a gap where love should have been. Victorian society often justified this neglect by blaming the poor themselves. If parents could not provide, it was seen as their fault, a result of laziness or immorality. Few recognized the structural forces, industrial exploitation, disease, lack of medical care, that left families vulnerable. The idea that the state should intervene to protect children was only beginning to emerge. Until then, countless young lives were left adrift. In the next chapter, we will turn from the streets to the dinner table, exploring how even in families that remained intact, food and health were constant struggles. Victorian parents often had to choose between hunger and survival, and their children paid the price: food, health, and starvation. If discipline and work defined much of Victorian childhood, hunger was the constant shadow that followed it. For poor families, food was often scarce, meals were plain, and children grew up with stomachs that never felt full. Even in wealthier households, ideas about nutrition were guided more by tradition and moral judgment than by science. Parents provided what they could, but what they could provide often fell far short of what children needed. In many ways, Victorian parenting was marked as much by what was missing from the dinner table as by what was present. For working-class families, daily meals were simple to the point of monotony. Bread was the staple, often dry, sometimes spread with dripping. The fat left from cooking meat. Porridge, potatoes, and weak tea filled out the diet. Meat was rare, usually reserved for Sundays if at all. Vegetables were seasonal and limited. Milk, when available, was often watered down or contaminated. Sugar, though increasingly cheap due to imports, was more a luxury than a regular part of meals. Children often went to bed hungry and woke up to the same. The Industrial Revolution had created an urban population larger than ever before, but the infrastructure to feed it had not kept pace. Fresh food was expensive, and preservation methods were limited. Parents did their best, but even their best often meant empty bellies for their children. In many homes, children ate last, after parents had taken their share. If food ran short, it was the youngest who suffered most. Malnutrition was common, and its effects showed in stunted growth, weakened immune systems, and constant fatigue. Health was no better. Sanitation in Victorian cities was poor, and diseases spread easily. Contaminated water led to outbreaks of cholera and typhoid. Tuberculosis, scarlet fever, and measles claimed countless young lives. Parents, desperate to cure their children, often turned to remedies that did more harm than good. Medicines sold in shops frequently contained dangerous ingredients like opium, alcohol, or mercury. Laudanum, a mixture of opium and alcohol, was widely used to soothe crying babies. Parents believed they were helping, but in reality, they were slowly poisoning their children. Even when children were not sick, the general standard of health was low. Factory work and long hours left little time for rest or play. Housing was cramped and damp, with poor ventilation. Smoke from coal fires filled the air, and soot coated walls and lungs alike. Parents could do little to protect their children from these conditions. The home, far from being a safe haven, often contributed to poor health. In wealthier families, food was more abundant, but not necessarily healthier. Meals were rich and heavy, with an emphasis on meat, bread, and puddings. Vegetables were sometimes dismissed as food for the poor. Sugar, increasingly available, was consumed in large quantities, leading to widespread dental problems. Parents encouraged their children to eat heartily. But the lack of nutritional knowledge meant that even wealthy children sometimes suffered from dietary imbalances. Attitudes toward food also reflected moral beliefs. Gluttony was considered a sin, and parents often warned their children against eating too much. At the same time, they scolded them for leaving food uneaten, even when portions were unmanageable. For poor children, begging for more was considered impolite or ungrateful. The image of Oliver Twist asking for more gruel captured this perfectly. A child punished not only for being hungry, but for daring to speak that hunger aloud. The emotional impact of hunger and ill health was profound. Children learned to suppress their needs, to endure discomfort silently, and to accept scarcity as normal. Parents, too, carried guilt and frustration, but in an era when poverty was blamed on individual weakness, they often saw their struggles as personal failures rather than social problems. The idea that society had a responsibility to ensure children's well-being was only beginning to take hold. Some reformers did try to address these issues. Philanthropists opened soup kitchens, and charities began providing free meals to school children. Medical science slowly advanced, bringing greater understanding of nutrition and disease prevention. But these changes came late in the century, and for much of the Victorian period, hunger and illness defined childhood. By today's standards, many of these conditions would be unthinkable. Modern laws ensure that children have access to food, healthcare, and safe housing. School meal programs, public health campaigns, and social services are designed to prevent the very neglect that was once commonplace. Parents today who fail to provide adequate nutrition or medical care could face intervention from child protection agencies. But in the Victorian world, such neglect was not neglect at all. It was simply life. To picture this reality, imagine a small girl sitting at a wooden table in a dimly lit kitchen. In front of her is a bowl of thin gruel, more water than oats. She eats slowly, trying to make it last, but the hunger in her belly gnaws on. Her mother, exhausted from a day of laundry work, watches silently. She knows the portion is too small, but there is no more. Tomorrow, if she earns a few more pennies, perhaps she can buy bread. Tonight the child will go to bed hungry again. Or imagine a boy coughing in a crowded, smoky tenement. His chest rattles with every breath, but his parents can offer no cure beyond a bottle of laudanum purchased cheaply from the corner shop. They spoon the bitter liquid into his mouth, praying it will soothe him. It does, but at a terrible cost. His body grows weaker, his dependency stronger. The parents believe they are helping, but unknowingly they are feeding poison. These were the daily realities of Victorian parenting. Providing food, health, and safety for children was a constant struggle, one in which love was present, but resources were absent. Parents did what they could, but what they could was often not enough. In the next chapter, we will turn to a lighter but still telling subject, play and entertainment. Even in their rare moments of leisure, Victorian children found that fun was often a luxury, and sometimes another tool of discipline. When we think of childhood today, toys and play seem inseparable from the experience. Brightly colored games, stuffed animals, and noisy gadgets fill nurseries and bedrooms. Play is celebrated as a vital part of learning, a way for children to develop imagination, social skills, and emotional resilience. But in the Victorian world, play was often treated with suspicion. Leisure for children was not considered essential. Instead, toys and entertainment were usually designed to reinforce discipline, teach lessons, or prepare children for their adult roles. What we now view as fun, Victorians often saw as training. For poor children, toys were scarce. Most working-class families could not afford to buy them. A child's toy might be nothing more than a stick, a piece of string, or a scrap of wood carved into a crude figure. Sometimes they made their own games from whatever was available, rolling hoops in the street, kicking tin cans, or playing games of chase. Entertainment, in this sense, was improvised and fleeting, squeezed into rare moments between work and chores. Parents did not encourage play. They tolerated it only when it did not interfere with survival. For middle and upper class children, toys were more available but carried strong moral messages. Dolls, for example, were among the most popular items for girls. But these dolls were not the playful, imaginative companions we might imagine today. They were often stiff, elaborately dressed figures meant to teach girls about fashion, domesticity, and motherhood. Girls learned to sew clothes for their dolls, practicing the skills they would one day use in running households. Play, in this case, was simply preparation for their adult duties. For boys, toy soldiers and miniature cannons were common. These were not merely for amusement, but were intended to instill patriotism, discipline, and readiness for military service. Games of war were seen as practice for real war. Other toys, such as building sets, trains, or mechanical puzzles, were designed to encourage order, logic, and problem-solving, qualities valued in the growing industrial society. Parents often chose toys deliberately, selecting those that reinforced obedience and responsibility rather than creativity or whimsy. Books and board games were also popular, but even these often carried moral lessons. Children's literature of the time frequently contained cautionary tales. Stories warned of the dangers of laziness, disobedience, or pride. Naughty children in these tales often met with grim fates, accidents, illnesses, or divine punishment. The message was clear. Play was acceptable only when it reinforced virtue. Even entertainment became a tool of discipline. Parlor games, enjoyed in wealthier households, followed similar patterns. Games like musical chairs or charades were structured, polite, and designed to encourage social grace rather than rowdy fun. Boys and girls were rarely allowed to play together unsupervised, and rules were enforced strictly. Playtime, even in leisure, remained bound by the constraints of Victorian morality. The suspicion of unstructured play came from a broader belief about childhood. Victorians saw idleness as dangerous. A child left to run free might grow unruly, disrespectful, or immoral. Work, chores, and structured activity were valued far more than spontaneous games. Parents who indulged their children with too much play were often criticized for raising weak or spoiled offspring. Spare the rod, spoil the child was the guiding principle in discipline, and the same mindset applied to play. Spare the order, spoil the child. There were, of course, exceptions. Some reformers began to argue for the importance of play in child development. The kindergarten movement, introduced from Germany by Friedrich Froebel, emphasized creative play and hands-on learning. Slowly, some schools and parents adopted these ideas, allowing children to build with blocks, sing songs, and explore the world through guided play. But these innovations were limited and often confined to wealthier families who could afford progressive schools. For the majority of Victorian children, play remained a luxury, and often a controlled one at that. The difference between classes was stark. A poor child in the city might play briefly in the street before being chased away by police or older boys. His toy might be a piece of coal or a discarded rag ball. Meanwhile, a wealthy child might sit in a nursery surrounded by carefully chosen toys, each with its own moral purpose. Yet in both cases, the message was similar. Play was secondary to preparation. Childhood was not an end in itself. It was merely practice for adulthood. By today's standards, this lack of free play would be considered harmful. Modern psychology emphasizes the importance of unstructured play for emotional, cognitive, and social development. Toys today are designed not only to entertain, but to encourage creativity and imagination. Parents are often encouraged to play with their children, to share in their fun, and to see play as a form of bonding. In contrast, Victorian parents often kept their distance, treating play as either unnecessary or as another tool for discipline. To picture the Victorian approach, imagine a little girl in 1870 sitting quietly with her doll. She is not rocking it gently or inventing stories of tea parties. Instead, she is carefully sewing a new dress for it, guided by her mother's instructions. Each stitch is meant to train her fingers for the domestic work ahead. Play, here, is practice, not pleasure. Or imagine a boy in a wealthy household arranging his toy soldiers on the carpet. His father watches with approval as he organizes them into ranks and files, mimicking the discipline of the army. The boy is praised not for creativity, but for orderliness. What appears to us as a game is, in truth, rehearsal for obedience. Meanwhile, in a back alley of Manchester, a poor child kicks a tin can with his friends. The game lasts only a few minutes before a factory whistle blows, and the boys scatter, some to work, some to errands, all to responsibility. Their moment of play was brief, unstructured, and overshadowed by the demands of survival. The story of Victorian toys and entertainment reminds us that even joy was filtered through the lens of discipline and morality. Children were rarely encouraged to dream freely or to lose themselves in play. Instead, every activity was measured against its usefulness in shaping them for adult life. In the next chapter, we will look at another cornerstone of Victorian parenting: silence and obedience. Just as play was controlled, so too was speech. To speak too much, too loudly, or at the wrong time could bring swift consequences. For Victorian children, even their voices were not entirely their own. If one phrase could sum up the Victorian ideal of childhood, it would be the well-known saying, "Children should be seen and not heard." These words captured the essence of how parents and society at large believed children ought to behave. Silence was a virtue, obedience was a duty, and any deviation from these expectations was treated as misbehavior. Today, we encourage children to express themselves, to ask questions, and to find their voices. But in the Victorian home, a child's voice was often seen as a nuisance, something to be suppressed, not celebrated. From an early age, children were taught to hold their tongues. At the dinner table, they sat stiffly, hands folded in their laps, eating only when given permission. Conversation was reserved for adults. To speak out of turn was to invite sharp rebuke or even physical punishment. A child who dared to interrupt an adult's story might be smacked on the hand or sent from the room in disgrace. Meals, which we now see as moments of family bonding, were often exercises in silence and formality. This expectation extended far beyond the dining room. In the presence of guests, children were to be polite but quiet. They might be brought in to recite a poem, sing a hymn, or display a newly learned skill. But once their performance was over, they were expected to vanish, returning to the nursery or another room. Adults did not see children as equals in conversation. To speak too much was seen as arrogance. To ask questions was often seen as impertinence. Obedience was equally emphasized. The hierarchy of the Victorian family was strict, with the father at the top, the mother below him, and the children at the bottom. Orders from parents were to be followed immediately and without question. Chores, lessons, and religious duties were carried out under constant supervision. A child who hesitated, argued, or resisted could expect swift correction. The very idea of negotiating with a child or explaining a command would have struck most Victorian parents as absurd. This culture of silence and obedience was reinforced by religion. Biblical teachings about honoring parents and obeying authority were frequently quoted in the home and the classroom. Disobedience was not merely a personal fault, but a moral failing. A child who spoke back to a parent risked not only punishment in this life, but according to the teaching of the time, punishment in the next. The threat of eternal damnation loomed over even the smallest acts of defiance. The psychological impact of this system was significant. Children grew up learning to suppress their feelings, their opinions, and their questions. They learned to listen more than they spoke, to obey rather than to think independently. While some adapted, becoming quiet, obedient adults, others carried wounds of fear and resentment. The absence of dialogue between parent and child created emotional distance, leaving many children unsure of their worth beyond their ability to conform. It is important to recognize that not all families enforced these rules with equal harshness. Some parents allowed their children more freedom of expression, and some mothers especially encouraged gentle conversation. But the cultural expectation was clear. A quiet child was a good child, and a questioning child was a bad one. Parents who failed to demand silence risked being judged by their neighbors as indulgent or careless. Even in play, silence was often enforced. Children playing too loudly indoors might be scolded for disturbing the adults. Outdoors, they were expected to keep their games within bounds, never attracting too much attention. The idea of a noisy, rambunctious group of children, something we might see as joyful today, was often frowned upon. Order and restraint were valued above laughter and spontaneity. By modern standards, this insistence on silence and unquestioning obedience would be seen as emotionally harmful. Today, child psychologists emphasize the importance of communication, self-expression, and dialogue between parents and children. A child's voice is considered essential to their development, teaching them confidence, empathy, and problem-solving skills. In contrast, the Victorian model suppressed individuality in favor of conformity. What was once considered good parenting is now understood as stifling. To picture this world, imagine a Victorian dining room in the 1880s. The father sits at the head of the table, the mother beside him. Two children sit quietly, their eyes on their plates. The only sounds are the clink of cutlery and the father's occasional comment. The children do not speak, they do not laugh. They eat quickly, then rise and bow their heads before leaving the room. The meal has filled their bellies but left them hungrier for affection and connection. Or picture a young boy eager to share a thought about his lesson. He opens his mouth to ask a question, but his teacher fixes him with a stern glare. "Silence," she commands, and the boy swallows his words. The question fades, the curiosity suppressed. For him, learning is not a dialogue but a duty carried out in quiet obedience. The Victorian ideal of silence and obedience reveals much about the era's view of children. They were not seen as developing individuals with voices worth hearing, but as unfinished adults whose role was to listen, learn, and conform. The modern celebration of childhood expression would have seemed chaotic, even dangerous, to many Victorians. Yet the cost of their rigid silence was high, generations of children raised in fear of their own voices. In the next chapter, we will explore another area where Victorian parenting went astray: medicine. When illness struck, parents often turned to remedies that we now know were dangerous. In their attempts to soothe and cure, they sometimes placed their children at even greater risk. When a Victorian child fell ill, parents faced a challenge that was as frightening as it was uncertain. Medical knowledge in the 19th century was limited, and treatments were often based more on tradition, guesswork, or superstition than on science. Parents, desperate to ease their children's suffering, turned to remedies that were not only ineffective but often dangerous. What was once considered good care now looks to us like neglect or even poisoning. In many ways, Victorian medicine reveals just how precarious childhood truly was in that era. One of the most common household remedies was laudanum, a mixture of opium and alcohol. Sold cheaply in apothecaries and even grocery stores, laudanum was used to treat everything from coughs to teething pains. Parents gave it to crying infants to soothe them, not realizing that it was highly addictive and often fatal. Babies dosed with laudanum sometimes slipped into unconsciousness and never woke again. Yet for Victorian parents, this was not considered reckless. It was ordinary care, recommended by neighbors, pamphlets, and even some doctors. Other remedies were just as harmful. Calomel, a compound containing mercury, was prescribed for digestive problems and teething. Castor oil was given to cleanse the body. Children suffering from fever might be bled with leeches or subjected to blistering treatments meant to draw out illness. Some cures involved forcing children to swallow powders or tonics that contained alcohol, arsenic, or other toxic substances. Parents, following the advice of the day, believed they were helping. In truth, they were often making their children worse. The use of alcohol was especially common. Beer, gin, and wine were frequently given to children in small amounts to calm them, help them sleep, or dull pain. Working-class mothers, exhausted after long hours of labor, sometimes slipped a little gin into their baby's milk to keep the child quiet. The intention was not cruelty but survival, a way to cope in impossible circumstances, but the results were devastating. Many children became sickly or died from these practices. Beyond medicine, the general understanding of health was deeply flawed. Germ theory, the idea that diseases were caused by microscopic organisms, was only beginning to gain acceptance in the late 19th century. Many parents and doctors still believed in miasma, the theory that illness came from bad air or foul smells. As a result, treatments often focused on ventilation, fumigation, or perfumes rather than hygiene or sanitation. Parents might open windows to let in fresh air, but allow contaminated water to flow freely into their homes. They did not know that the cholera spreading through their neighborhoods was in the water, not the air. Superstition also played a role. Some parents used charms or folk remedies to ward off illness. A piece of coral hung around a baby's neck was thought to help with teething. Certain herbs, teas, or poultices were believed to cure ailments, regardless of their actual effects. These traditions, passed down through generations, offered comfort, if not real healing. Hospitals, when used, were often places of last resort. They were crowded, unsanitary, and feared by many. Poor families in particular avoided them, seeing them as places where people went to die. Instead, most parents relied on home remedies or the advice of local healers. Wealthier families consulted private doctors, but even their treatments were based on limited knowledge. The difference between rich and poor was less in the effectiveness of care than in the comfort of surroundings. The high rates of childhood mortality reflected these medical misconceptions. Diseases like measles, diphtheria, and scarlet fever, which are now preventable through vaccines, claimed countless lives. Diarrheal diseases, often caused by contaminated water or spoiled food, were among the leading killers of infants. Parents grieved, but they also accepted such deaths as part of life. To lose a child was a tragedy, yet it was so common that many families expected it. Parents sometimes avoided becoming too attached to infants in their early years, fearing they might not survive. And yet, despite the dangers, parents' intentions were almost always rooted in love and desperation. A mother spooning laudanum into her baby's mouth was not trying to harm her child. She was trying to quiet the cries, to ease suffering, and to find rest for both herself and her infant. A father taking his feverish son to be bled by a doctor believed he was doing what was necessary to save him. They acted within the limits of what they knew. What we now call negligence or abuse was, in their eyes, responsibility. By today's standards, many of these practices would lead to intervention by child protection agencies. Giving alcohol or opiates to children is considered abuse. Failing to seek proper medical care can result in charges of neglect. Modern medicine provides antibiotics, vaccines, and safe treatments that parents are expected to use. To imagine parents casually dosing their infants with opium seems unthinkable. And yet, in the Victorian age, it was commonplace. To picture this world, imagine a mother in a dimly lit room rocking her crying baby. The child's face is red with fever, its tiny fists clenched in distress. Exhausted, the mother reaches for a brown bottle of laudanum, pours a spoonful and gently tips it into the baby's mouth. Within minutes, the crying stops. The baby sleeps peacefully, but the mother does not know that each dose brings the child closer to danger. To her, this is relief. To us, it is tragedy. Or imagine a father holding down his son while a doctor applies leeches to his chest to treat a cough. The boy squirms and cries out, frightened and in pain. The father whispers reassurances, believing this suffering will save his child. The doctor nods gravely, confident in his methods. Both men are sincere, but both are wrong. The treatment offers no cure, only trauma. The story of Victorian medicine is a story of limits. Parents loved their children and wanted to protect them, but they lacked the knowledge and resources to do so safely. Their remedies were rooted in misunderstanding, their choices shaped by desperation. What they believed to be care often became harm. In the next chapter, we will explore how religion added another layer to parenting. For many Victorians, faith was not just part of life, it was the foundation of moral instruction. Children were taught to fear not only their parents' punishments, but also the eternal consequences of disobedience. In the Victorian age, religion was not simply a private matter of faith. It was the framework through which families understood the world, their duties, and the proper way to raise children. For many parents, to raise a child without strict religious guidance was to risk not only their behavior in this life, but the fate of their soul in the next. Parenting, therefore, was as much about preparing children for heaven as it was about preparing them for adulthood on earth. From the earliest years, children were taught prayers, hymns, and Bible verses. Morning and evening prayers were part of the daily routine in many households, with children kneeling beside their beds as parents or governesses listened. Grace was said before meals, and Sunday was devoted entirely to church services, Sunday school, and Bible readings at home. For parents, these rituals were not optional. They were obligations, essential for shaping moral character and ensuring obedience. The Bible was also the foundation of discipline. Passages about obedience, sin, and punishment were quoted frequently. Children were reminded that disobedience was not only a slight against their parents, but against God. The commandment to honor thy father and mother was repeated often, reinforcing the authority of parents as divinely sanctioned. Corporal punishment itself was justified through Scripture, with verses about the rod and correction cited as evidence that striking children was not only acceptable, but necessary. Religious instruction extended into nearly every area of life. Reading lessons were often based on Bible passages, ensuring that literacy was tied to moral teaching. Stories told to children carried strong lessons. Honesty was rewarded, disobedience punished, pride brought downfall, and humility brought blessing. Few stories ended happily without some reminder of virtue. Even fairy tales, when retold in children's books, were often reshaped to emphasize morality rather than magic or adventure. The emphasis on sin weighed heavily on children. From a young age, they were told that they were born sinful, that their natural inclinations were wicked, and that only strict obedience and faith could save them. The idea of eternal damnation was not softened for young ears. Parents and teachers warned children that lies, laziness, or disobedience could condemn them to hellfire. Bedtime prayers often included confessions of sin, leaving children to fall asleep with the weight of guilt and fear. For many, this created a constant atmosphere of anxiety. A child who broke a household rule might not only fear the cane, but also eternal punishment. The line between parental authority and divine authority blurred, making rebellion against one indistinguishable from rebellion against the other. A child's relationship with God was mediated through their parents, who presented themselves as both caregivers and moral guardians. The Sunday routine illustrates this influence clearly. For working-class children, Sunday was often the only day free from labor. But instead of being a day of play, it became a day of religious duty. Families attended long church services in the morning, sometimes again in the afternoon, and spent the rest of the day in Bible study or hymn singing at home. Play, laughter, or games were discouraged. Sunday was a day of solemnity, reflection, and discipline. To Victorian parents, this was proper moral training. To modern eyes, it seems joyless, even oppressive. This heavy emphasis on religious obedience was not without consequences. While some children grew up with strong moral compasses and lasting faith, others carried guilt, fear, and resentment into adulthood. Many remembered their childhoods as filled with rules but lacking warmth. Some reformers, even within religious circles, began to criticize these methods, arguing that Christianity should emphasize love, compassion, and kindness, rather than fear and punishment. But for much of the century, fear remained the dominant tool. The role of religion also reinforced the strict gender roles of the era. Boys were taught to be leaders, providers, and defenders of the faith. Girls were taught modesty, humility, and domestic virtue. Sermons and religious tracts warned against vanity, frivolity, and independence, especially for women. Parents, guided by these teachings, shaped their children according to a moral code that left little room for individuality. By modern standards, much of this would be considered emotionally harmful. Today, we recognize the importance of nurturing a child's sense of self-worth, curiosity, and individuality. Fear-based teaching, especially involving threats of eternal punishment, is often seen as psychologically damaging. Religious instruction itself is not condemned, but the methods of instilling it, through fear, guilt, and constant warnings, would raise alarm among child psychologists and welfare workers. To imagine this Victorian reality, picture a small boy kneeling by his bed, hands clasped tightly, as his mother leads him in prayer. He recites the words, his voice trembling slightly. He has been told that God watches every action, every thought, and that bad behavior brings not only punishment from his father, but also eternal fire. He is only 7, but already he carries the weight of fear heavier than his small shoulders should bear. Or picture a Sunday in a working-class home. The children, tired from a week of labor, long to run outside and play. Instead, they sit in stiff chairs as their father reads long passages from the Bible. They are warned about sin, reminded of hell, and instructed to memorize verses. Their minds wander, their bodies fidget, but their parents' stern eyes keep them still. The day ends not with laughter or play, but with more prayers before bed. The story of religion in Victorian parenting is complex. It gave many families structure, meaning, and a sense of purpose. But it also instilled fear, suppressed individuality, and often replaced love with judgment. To the Victorians, this was moral training. To us, it is a reminder of how deeply parenting can be shaped by the beliefs of the time. In the next chapter, we will look at how these practices varied across social classes. Parenting among the wealthy was very different from parenting among the poor, but both carried their own forms of hardship and control. Victorian childhood was far from a single experience. The gap between rich and poor shaped nearly every aspect of a child's life, from food and education to affection and discipline. A child born into poverty faced hunger, labor, and neglect, while a child born into wealth lived among comforts and servants. Yet wealth did not always mean warmth. Parenting in both worlds carried its own kinds of hardship, and both produced scars that would be seen as unacceptable today. For poor families, parenting was defined by survival. Fathers and mothers worked long hours in factories, mines, or as servants, leaving little time for nurturing. Children were often sent to work alongside them, their small wages essential to the household budget. A 6-year-old carrying coal or a 10-year-old sweeping chimneys was not unusual. In such families, discipline was direct and harsh, guided by exhaustion as much as by principle. A child who disobeyed might be beaten not only for defiance, but for endangering the family's survival. Love was present, but it was overshadowed by constant struggle. In wealthier families, the situation looked very different on the surface. Grand houses, fine meals, and expensive clothing seemed to promise a golden childhood. Yet wealthy parents often played only a small role in raising their children. The day-to-day care was left to nurses, governesses, and tutors. Children in upper-class homes sometimes saw their mothers only briefly each day, and their fathers even less. Affection was delegated, replaced by formality. Parenting in this world was more about management than about intimacy. The nursery, a room set aside for children in wealthy homes, symbolized this distance. Here, nurses bathed, dressed, and fed the children, while governesses oversaw their lessons. The nursery was often physically separate from the main living spaces, reinforcing the idea that children belonged to their own sphere until they were old enough to join adult company. Parents visited occasionally, expecting polite manners and neat appearances, but rarely engaged in play or conversation. For many upper-class children, their strongest bonds were with servants, not parents. This arrangement created a paradox. Poor children longed for the comforts of the rich, but rich children often longed for the affection of the poor. A wealthy child might have silk dresses and fine toys, but little emotional warmth. A poor child might have a mother's exhausted embrace, but no bread to eat. Neither world offered what modern parenting considers essential: consistent presence, affection, and security. Education also highlighted the divide. Poor children, if they received schooling at all, often attended ragged schools or Sunday schools where discipline was strict and resources scarce. Wealthy children, by contrast, were taught languages, music, and history by private tutors. Boys were often sent to elite boarding schools where discipline could be brutal, while girls were trained in accomplishments to prepare for marriage. Both systems, however, shared the same emphasis on obedience and control. Whether in a ragged classroom or a gilded one, children learned more about order than about self-expression. Discipline itself crossed class lines, though it took different forms. Poor parents punished directly, often with the hand, belt, or stick. Wealthy parents delegated discipline to tutors or schoolmasters who wielded the cane with equal severity. In both cases, physical punishment was considered necessary. What differed was the setting, the cramped kitchen of a tenement versus the polished study of a country house. Pain was the common language of correction. Gender roles also played out differently across the classes. Poor girls were expected to work as maids, washerwomen, or caregivers from a young age, while boys labored in factories or on the streets. Wealthy girls were groomed to marry advantageously. Their education focused on music, needlework, and modesty. Wealthy boys were prepared for professional careers, politics, or military service. In both worlds, childhood was shaped less by the child's own interests than by the demands of society. Despite these differences, both rich and poor parents shared one belief: children were not to be indulged. Affection was rationed, not freely given. To spoil a child was to risk their character. Whether through poverty's necessity or wealth's formality, emotional distance defined the parent-child relationship. Modern concepts of attachment, bonding, and emotional validation were virtually unknown. The emotional consequences were profound. Poor children often grew up hardened by struggle, their childhoods cut short by labor and hunger. Wealthy children often grew up distant from their parents, raised in environments of formality and expectation. Both groups carried scars, the scars of neglect in one case, and of emotional abandonment in the other. By today's standards, both forms of parenting would raise alarms. Poor families would be accused of neglect for sending children to work or leaving them hungry. Wealthy families would be criticized for emotional neglect, for failing to provide direct affection and presence. In both cases, child welfare services would intervene. But in the Victorian age, these practices were not only normal but often praised. A disciplined, well-ordered child was considered proof of good parenting, whether in rags or in lace. To picture this contrast, imagine two scenes side by side. In a poor London tenement, a mother hands her son a crust of bread and sends him to the factory before dawn. She kisses his head quickly, then turns back to her washing, already exhausted. In a country estate, a wealthy child sits in a nursery, dressed in fine clothes. A governess corrects her manners as she practices her French verbs. Her mother enters briefly, smiles, and leaves. Both children are loved in their parents' ways. Both are neglected in ours. The comparison between rich and poor parenting in the Victorian age reveals an important truth. Wealth changed the conditions of childhood, but not always for the better. Comfort did not guarantee closeness, and poverty did not erase love. Both extremes failed to provide what children need most: consistent care, affection, and recognition of their individuality. In the next chapter, we will turn to a subject that reveals how deeply Victorian parents saw their children as miniature adults: marriage and early responsibilities. For many young people, adolescence was brief, and the transition to adulthood came shockingly early. In the modern world, we tend to think of adolescence as a bridge between childhood and adulthood, a time for education, growth, and gradual independence. But in the Victorian age, this stage was often cut short. Children were expected to step into adult responsibilities early, whether through work, caretaking, or even marriage. Parents, driven by necessity, tradition, or social ambition, often treated teenagers as fully grown long before their bodies or minds were ready. What we would now call exploitation, coercion, or neglect was once considered the natural course of life. One of the clearest examples of this was marriage. In the 19th century, legal age limits for marriage were much lower than today. Girls could marry as young as 12 with parental consent, and boys at 14. While such young unions were not the norm in upper-class society, they did occur, especially in working-class communities where economic survival depended on forming households early. Even when formal marriage did not happen until later, betrothals and expectations of future matches began in the teenage years, often arranged by parents. For poor families, early marriage was sometimes seen as a relief. A daughter married young meant one less mouth to feed, and perhaps an alliance that brought stability or income. Parents encouraged matches that promised financial survival rather than affection. A girl of 16 might be married to a man twice her age because he had steady employment, while her parents believed they were securing her future. To us, this seems like coercion. To them, it was practicality. Wealthier families had their own version of early responsibility. Daughters of the upper and middle classes were groomed for marriage almost from birth. Their education emphasized music, French, needlework and etiquette, accomplishments designed to make them attractive wives. Parents arranged introductions, supervised social events, and sometimes pressured daughters into advantageous unions. Love was secondary to family honor and financial alliance. A girl who resisted such expectations risked her parents' disapproval and the loss of social standing. Boys, too, were expected to assume adult roles early. Working-class boys often left school by the age of 10 or 12 to contribute wages. By their teenage years, they might be supporting their families or even acting as heads of households if fathers were absent. Wealthier boys were pushed toward university, the military, or professional careers. Parents placed enormous pressure on sons to carry the family name and reputation forward. Failure was not an option. Boys, too, were expected to assume adult roles early. Working-class boys often left school by the age of 10 or 12 to contribute wages. By their teenage years, they might be supporting their families or even acting as heads of households if fathers were absent. Wealthier boys were pushed toward university, the military, or professional careers. Parents placed enormous pressure on sons to carry the family name and reputation forward. Failure was not an option. Beyond marriage, children often assumed responsibilities for younger siblings. In large families, common in the Victorian era, older children acted as surrogate parents. A girl of 9 might be expected to care for an infant while her mother worked. A boy of 12 might be tasked with managing household errands or guarding siblings in the streets. Parents relied on these arrangements not because they were cruel, but because survival demanded it. Childhood was a luxury few could afford. This early burden of responsibility was reinforced by society's acceptance of it. Literature and moral tracts often praised young people who took on adult roles with seriousness. A teenage girl who devoted herself to caring for her siblings was praised as virtuous. A teenage boy who contributed wages or supported his widowed mother was admired as dutiful. There was little recognition of the emotional cost. The exhaustion, lost opportunities, and stolen years of childhood went largely unnoticed. The effects were profound. Many Victorian children grew up without ever experiencing a true sense of youth. They entered adulthood not through gradual growth, but through sudden demands. Girls became wives and mothers before they had finished being children themselves. Boys became workers, soldiers, or breadwinners before they could explore their own interests or dreams. Parents, in shaping these paths, believed they were fulfilling their duty. Today, we would call it exploitation. The legal system reflected these norms. There were few protections against child marriage, few restrictions on child labor, and little recognition of adolescence as a unique stage of life. It was not until the late Victorian period, with the rise of reform movements, that new laws began to raise the minimum age for marriage and limit child labor. Campaigners argued that children needed time to grow, to learn, and to play. But for much of the century, such ideas were dismissed as indulgent. By modern standards, these practices would be condemned. Today, child marriage is outlawed in most Western countries, and international organizations campaign against it worldwide. Parents who forced their children into early unions would face legal action. Older siblings tasked with caring for younger ones all day while parents worked might trigger investigations for neglect. Adolescence is now recognized as a critical period, with protections designed to ensure education and emotional development. To picture this Victorian reality, imagine a 16-year-old girl standing nervously at the altar beside a man of 30. Her parents beam with pride, believing they have secured her future. She, however, feels fear and confusion, knowing little of what lies ahead. To her family, this is a success. To us, it is coercion. Or imagine a 14-year-old boy, his father dead, his mother struggling to make ends meet. He leaves school to work full-time in a factory, handing over his wages to keep food on the table. He is still a child in body, but already a man in responsibility. His shoulders carry more than they should, and his youth slips away unnoticed. These stories remind us that early responsibility was not always born of cruelty, but of necessity and tradition. Parents acted within the expectations of their time, often believing they were doing what was best. Yet the cost to their children was immense. Childhood was shortened, individuality suppressed, and futures decided too soon. In the next chapter, we will explore child death and emotional distance. When we look at Victorian family life, one fact stands out above all others. Childhood was fragile. Disease, accidents, and poverty meant that death was a constant presence. Infant mortality was shockingly high, and even older children were far from safe. Parents lived with the knowledge that any day might bring tragedy. This reality shaped the way they raised their children, often creating a kind of emotional distance that seems cold to us but was, for them, a shield against unbearable grief. Statistics alone tell the story. In the mid-19th century, nearly 1 in 5 children in Britain died before the age of 5. In working-class districts, the numbers were even worse. Outbreaks of measles, diphtheria, scarlet fever, and cholera swept through crowded cities, claiming young lives by the thousands. Poor nutrition, contaminated water, and lack of medical knowledge made survival uncertain. Even wealthy families were not immune. Disease crossed class lines. Queen Victoria herself lost a child, and many aristocratic families mourned small coffins carried out of grand houses. Faced with this grim reality, many parents adopted a stoic attitude. To show too much affection for a baby was, in some minds, to invite deeper pain if the child died. Advice manuals often cautioned mothers not to indulge their infants with excessive love. A baby was to be fed, clothed, and disciplined, but not spoiled with kisses or cuddles. Some parents withheld emotional closeness until a child had survived the dangerous early years. Love was present, but it was guarded, rationed in case tragedy struck. This emotional distance could seem heartless. Modern parents, who celebrate every milestone and photograph every smile, struggle to imagine holding back affection out of fear of loss. Yet for Victorians, it was a form of self-preservation. In households where several children might die in quick succession, grief was a recurring wound. Parents learned to steel themselves, to mourn briefly, and to carry on. A mother who lost a baby might be pregnant again within months, her attention shifting to the next fragile life. The rituals of mourning reflected this strange balance of grief and detachment. Child funerals were solemn, often small affairs. Tiny coffins were carried through crowded streets, reminders to all of the precariousness of life. Mourning clothes were worn, prayers recited, but public displays of deep emotion were discouraged. Parents were expected to bear loss with dignity, trusting in God's will. To question or rage against fate was seen as weakness or even impiety. For surviving children, the atmosphere of loss was inescapable. They grew up aware that death might come for them or their siblings at any time. Parents, too, reminded them constantly of life's fragility, often tying discipline to mortality. A disobedient child might be warned that God could strike them down. Illness was sometimes framed as punishment for sin. In this way, death was not only a physical threat, but a moral lesson. Yet grief, though restrained, did exist. Many mothers poured their sorrow into diaries, letters, or memorial albums. Some kept locks of hair from deceased children, preserved in jewelry or pressed into family Bibles. Poets and writers of the era reflected on the pain of losing children, capturing emotions that polite society often suppressed. Behind the stern exterior of Victorian parenting lay oceans of unspoken grief. The emotional distance created by high mortality had lasting effects on the parent-child bond. Some children grew up feeling unloved, mistaking their parents' caution for indifference. Others grew up resilient, hardened by an environment where death was a fact of life. But either way, the intimacy we expect between parents and children today was often absent. Parenting was shaped not only by values of discipline and obedience, but by the shadow of mortality itself. By modern standards, such detachment would seem deeply harmful. Today, child psychologists emphasize the importance of bonding, attachment, and emotional security, especially in the earliest years. Parents are encouraged to respond to cries, to cuddle, to express love openly. To withhold affection out of fear would be considered neglectful. But in the Victorian world, withholding love was sometimes seen as wisdom. To picture this reality, imagine a Victorian nursery. A baby lies in a wooden cradle, swaddled tightly. The nurse rocks the cradle gently, while the mother watches from a distance. She smiles faintly, but does not pick the baby up. She knows too well that the infant might not live to see its first birthday. Her heart aches with love, but she holds it back, protecting herself from grief she has already endured before. Or imagine a small funeral procession on a foggy street. A tiny white coffin is carried past rows of onlookers. The parents follow, dressed in black, their faces solemn but composed. They do not cry openly. Society expects dignity, yet inside their hearts are breaking. Tomorrow, life will return to its routine. The surviving children still need discipline, meals, and prayers. Grief has no time to linger. The story of child death and emotional distance reveals one of the harshest truths about Victorian parenting. Even love itself was shaped by fear. Parents cared deeply for their children, but the fragility of life forced them to express that care in restrained, sometimes cold ways. To us, it feels unnatural. To them, it was survival. In the next chapter, we will explore how society viewed these practices. Parenting was not only a private matter, but a public one, judged by neighbors, clergy, and institutions. The opinions of others reinforced discipline and often silenced compassion, making Victorian parenting as much about reputation as about love. Parenting in the Victorian age was not only a private matter, it was also a performance. One acted out under the watchful eyes of neighbors, clergy, and society at large. Every choice a parent made, from the way children dressed to how they behaved in public, was subject to judgment. To raise a child improperly was not only seen as a failure of the family, but as a moral stain upon the community. This constant scrutiny reinforced harsh parenting practices, making discipline not just a personal conviction, but a social expectation. The influence of religion played a central role in shaping these opinions. Churches were among the strongest voices in Victorian society, preaching sermons about duty, obedience, and family order. Ministers reminded parents of their sacred responsibility to raise children in the fear of God. Congregations noticed whether children sat still in pews, recited their verses correctly, or behaved with quiet reverence. A restless child could bring whispers of criticism, not only against the child, but against the mother and father. A family's reputation, in many ways, rested on the silence and discipline of its youngest members. Neighbors, too, acted as informal monitors of family life. In crowded working-class neighborhoods, where homes stood close together, daily activities were often visible to others. A mother who failed to control her children's noise, or who allowed them to roam the streets unchecked, risked gossip. A father who drank heavily and neglected discipline became a subject of scorn. Even in wealthier districts, appearances mattered. Well-dressed, polite children reflected well on their parents, while disorderly behavior was seen as shameful. Parents disciplined their children not only for the child's sake, but to preserve their own standing in the eyes of others. The press also contributed to shaping public opinion. Newspapers frequently carried stories of crime, disorder, or tragedy, and children often appeared in these narratives as cautionary figures. A boy caught stealing apples was described as the product of parental neglect. A girl who fell into misfortune was blamed on a mother's indulgence or failure to instill virtue. These stories reinforced the idea that a parent's reputation depended on strict control. To be lenient was to risk public humiliation through one's children. This culture of judgment encouraged harsh discipline. Parents who spared the rod risked being seen as weak. A child who spoke out of turn in public embarrassed not only themselves but their entire family. Mothers in particular bore the weight of this scrutiny. A quiet, obedient child reflected her success. A noisy or unruly child reflected her failure. Fathers too felt the pressure to be authoritative, to maintain order, and to display their children as proof of their strength. Even institutions reinforced these expectations. Schools sent notes home about children's behavior, and teachers openly blamed parents for a child's failures. Workhouses judged parents for allowing poverty to claim their children, even when circumstances were beyond their control. Courts and magistrates frequently punished parents for children's crimes, holding them responsible for theft, truancy, or misbehavior. Parenting was not viewed as a private journey, but as a civic responsibility, policed by everyone from local authorities to strangers on the street. The result was a society where parents parented under constant pressure. Discipline became not just a way to guide children, but a way to defend one's own honor. Affection was withheld, not only because of beliefs about spoiling, but also because a child who appeared too indulged reflected poorly on the family. To raise a child with freedom, creativity, or leniency risked being branded as careless. By modern standards, this level of social interference would be considered oppressive. Today, while parents still face judgment from peers, parenting styles are more varied and tolerated. A child speaking at the dinner table, playing loudly in the yard, or asking questions in church would not bring scandal. Parents are encouraged to nurture individuality rather than suppress it for the sake of appearances. Victorian parents, however, had little such freedom. Their children were mirrors of their reputations, and discipline was the polish that kept that mirror shining. To picture this atmosphere, imagine a Victorian family walking to church on a Sunday morning. The father leads, the mother follows, and the children trail behind in tidy clothes. The street is lined with neighbors who glance up as they pass. The children walk in silence, their eyes lowered. A single misstep, a laugh, a stumble, a whisper, could bring disapproving looks. The parents know it, the children know it, and so the performance continues. Or picture a working-class mother in a crowded tenement. Her children play noisily in the yard, drawing the attention of neighbors. Gossip begins. She cannot control them. That evening, she scolds and smacks them more harshly than she might otherwise have, not out of malice, but out of fear of what others will say. Her authority in the community depends on her children's obedience, and her children pay the price for that reputation. Public opinion in the Victorian age served as both a guide and a whip. It reinforced values of discipline, morality, and control, but it also robbed families of privacy and compassion. Parents lived not only with their own beliefs, but with the constant echo of society's expectations. Children, in turn, grew up as performers, shaped not only by their parents' authority, but by the collective gaze of the community. In the next chapter, we will explore how cracks began to appear in this system. Reformers, writers, and critics started to challenge the harsh realities of Victorian parenting, calling for change. Their voices laid the foundation for the child protection laws and social attitudes we take for granted today. For much of the Victorian age, strict discipline, child labor, and emotional distance were accepted as normal, even praiseworthy. Parents believed they were raising strong, obedient, and moral citizens. But as the century progressed, cracks began to appear in this system. Writers, reformers, and campaigners began to argue that children were not miniature adults, not born in sin alone, but beings in need of protection care, and nurture. Their voices, often dismissed at first, grew louder until they reshaped society's understanding of childhood. One of the most influential figures was Charles Dickens. Through novels like Oliver Twist, David Copperfield, and Hard Times, Dickens exposed the harsh realities faced by poor and working-class children. His characters, hungry orphans, overworked apprentices, abused schoolboys, were fictional, but they reflected real conditions. Dickens himself had known hardship as a child laborer in a blacking factory, and his writing carried both empathy and outrage. His stories reached a wide audience, forcing middle and upper-class readers to confront the suffering they preferred to ignore. For many Victorians, Dickens was the first to make them see children not as nuisances or workers, but as vulnerable human beings. Alongside literature came the work of reformers. The Factory Acts, passed gradually throughout the 19th century, began to limit child labor. Early versions restricted the hours children could work in textile mills. Later reforms extended protections to mines and other industries. By the late century, laws required that children spend a certain number of hours in school, reducing their time in labor. These acts were not born overnight, but through years of campaigning by activists who argued that childhood should not be spent in endless toil. Education reform was another turning point. The Elementary Education Act of 1870 established for the first time the framework for compulsory schooling in England and Wales. Though not immediately universal, it marked a shift. Society was beginning to see education as a right rather than a privilege. Campaigners like Mary Carpenter, who founded Ragged Schools for Poor Children, argued that education could lift children out of poverty and give them a chance at a better life. Parents, once expected to send their children to work, were now urged, and eventually required, to send them to school. The rise of child-saving movements further challenged Victorian parenting. Organizations like the Children's Aid Society and later the National Society for the Prevention of Cruelty to Children, NSPCC, emerged to address abuse and neglect. For the first time, institutions claimed authority to intervene in family life when children were mistreated. This was a radical idea. For centuries, the family had been seen as a private kingdom, with parents holding absolute authority. Reformers argued that children too had rights to safety, health, and dignity. Medical advances also began to reshape thinking. As germ theory gained acceptance, parents were encouraged to improve sanitation, hygiene, and nutrition. Doctors began to warn against dangerous remedies like laudanum, and public health campaigns promoted vaccination against smallpox. Parents who once relied on superstition or harmful tonics slowly turned toward more scientific methods of care. The idea that children could be protected from disease rather than merely resigned to it gave families new hope. Religious attitudes also shifted, at least in part. While stern sermons about sin and obedience continued, some churches began to emphasize compassion, kindness, and the innocence of children. Sunday schools, though still moral in tone, offered education and community as well as discipline. The image of the child as inherently sinful gave way slowly to the image of the child as innocent and in need of nurture. This transformation was uneven, but it planted seeds for modern understandings of childhood. Writers and thinkers outside of Dickens also contributed. Philosophers like John Stuart Mill argued for individual liberty, ideas that extended, indirectly, to children. Educators influenced by continental thinkers, such as Friedrich Froebel, promoted play-based learning and kindergartens, challenging the rigid silence of traditional classrooms. These voices did not immediately overturn Victorian norms, but they provided alternatives that some parents, especially in progressive circles, began to adopt. Still, resistance was strong. Many Victorians clung to the old belief that discipline and fear were the only paths to virtue. Reformers were often criticized as sentimental, indulgent, or unrealistic, yet slowly public opinion shifted. High-profile cases of child abuse reported in newspapers shocked the public and fueled calls for protection laws. Tragedies, once hidden behind closed doors, became catalysts for change. By the end of the Victorian era, the foundations of modern child welfare were in place. Compulsory education had begun. Child labor was increasingly restricted. Institutions like the NSPCC existed to advocate for children's rights. Parenting manuals began to speak, tentatively, of affection and understanding, alongside discipline. The transformation was far from complete, but the idea that children deserved protection had entered the public consciousness. From our perspective, these reforms seem obvious, even overdue. But in the 19th century, they represented a profound shift in how society viewed children. For centuries, children had been seen primarily as economic assets, moral projects, or miniature adults. Reformers argued they were individuals with their own needs and rights. This shift laid the groundwork for the idea, radical in its time, that childhood should be protected, cherished, and prolonged. To picture this turning point, imagine a London meeting hall in the 1880s. Reformers gather, their speeches passionate. One describes the plight of factory children. Another reads letters from mothers whose babies died after being dosed with laudanum. In the audience, listeners murmur with discomfort. Some scoff, but others nod, their consciences stirred. Outside in the streets, children still beg and work, but inside, the seeds of change are being sown. Or picture a ragged school in the same decade. Dozens of poor children crowd into a dim room. The lessons are simple, the resources meager, but for the first time, they are learning letters and numbers instead of laboring in the streets. Their teacher, harried but hopeful, believes that education can change their futures. It is not yet the childhood we know today, but it is a beginning. The first calls for reform remind us that progress does not come all at once. Victorian parents, shaped by tradition and necessity, could not always see alternatives. But writers, reformers, and campaigners opened their eyes to new possibilities. Their efforts transformed parenting from a private, unquestioned authority into a public concern, laying the foundation for laws and attitudes that protect children today. In the next chapter, we will explore how, when viewed side by side, Victorian parenting practices clash with modern laws. What was once discipline is now abuse. What was once survival is now neglect. And what was once normal would today be illegal. And as we have seen, Victorian parents raised their children in ways that reflected the values of their time: obedience, discipline, duty, and survival. To them, these methods seem necessary, even virtuous. But when we hold these practices against the standards of modern law and child protection, the differences are striking. What was once ordinary in the 19th century would today bring interventions from social workers, legal charges, or public outrage. Perhaps the most obvious example is corporal punishment. In Victorian homes and schools, striking children with canes, belts, or whips was not only common, but encouraged. Parents who failed to punish physically risked being labeled as weak. Today, such practices are considered abuse in many countries. In the United States, while some forms of spanking remain legal in private homes, severe corporal punishment that leaves marks or injuries can lead to charges of child abuse. In schools, corporal punishment is banned in most states. Across much of Europe, hitting children is outlawed altogether, even in the home. By these standards, the routine punishments of the Victorian age would make many parents and teachers criminals. Another clear violation by modern measures is child labor. In the Victorian world, children as young as 5 worked in factories, mines, and on the streets. Parents often relied on their children's wages for survival, and society defended the practice as moral training. Today, international laws strictly forbid child labor in dangerous or exploitative conditions. In the United States, the Fair Labor Standards Act sets minimum ages and limits for work. A parent who sent a 7-year-old to clean chimneys or a 10-year-old to work 12 hours in a mill would face prosecution. What Victorians called education through labor is now recognized as exploitation. Neglect, too, was widespread in ways that would alarm modern authorities. Poor parents often left infants in the care of very young siblings or allowed children to wander the streets unsupervised. Some dosed their babies with laudanum or gin to keep them quiet while they worked. Today, such acts would be considered gross neglect and child endangerment. Parents could lose custody or face imprisonment. Modern child protection systems exist precisely to prevent the kind of unattended, vulnerable childhood that was once a daily reality. The use of dangerous medicines provides another stark contrast. Victorian parents, following common advice, gave children opium-based syrups, mercury compounds, and alcohol to ease pain or induce sleep. These remedies often harmed or killed the very children they were meant to help. Today, giving a child such substances would be treated as poisoning, with severe legal consequences. Pharmaceutical regulations, pediatric medicine, and public health campaigns now ensure that children receive safe, evidence-based treatments. The Victorian expectation of silence and obedience also clashes with modern ideas of children's rights. To silence a child at the dinner table, to punish them for asking questions, or to humiliate them publicly with a dunce cap would now be seen as emotional abuse. Modern psychology emphasizes the importance of self-expression, dialogue, and encouragement. While not every form of Victorian strictness would break the law, many would fall under guidelines for emotional neglect or abuse, warranting intervention. Early marriage is another practice that modern law rejects. In the 19th century, girls as young as 12 could marry with parental consent, and teenagers were often pressured into unions arranged for economic or social advantage. Today, child marriage is illegal in most Western countries, with age of consent and marriage laws designed to protect young people from coercion. A Victorian parent who arranged a marriage for their teenage daughter to an older man would now face criminal charges. Even the emotional detachment shaped by high child mortality would raise questions today. Parents who withheld affection out of fear of loss might not face legal punishment, but modern child welfare agencies would likely intervene if children showed signs of emotional neglect. Attachment, bonding, and love are now seen as essential parts of parenting, and their absence can be as damaging as physical harm. The role of public opinion has also shifted. In the Victorian age, neighbors and communities judged parents harshly for being too lenient. Today, the opposite is often true. Parents are criticized for being too strict or too distant. Society now expects parents to provide warmth, emotional support, and encouragement. Failure to do so, especially if combined with visible harm, can lead not only to social disapproval, but to legal action. When we compare these worlds, it becomes clear that the very definition of parenting has changed. In the Victorian era, parents were judged by how well they controlled their children. In the modern era, parents are judged by how well they nurture them. What Victorians called discipline, we call abuse. What they saw as training, we see as exploitation. What they accepted as normal, we condemn as neglect. To picture this contrast, imagine a modern social worker transported back to a Victorian home. She sees a father beating his son with a cane for spilling soup. She sees a baby soothed with a spoonful of opium. She sees a 10-year-old girl sewing for hours to prepare for marriage, and a 12-year-old boy crawling into a coal mine. To her, each of these scenes is a violation, reasons to call the police, remove the children, and file charges. But to the Victorians, these are ordinary acts of parenting. Or imagine the reverse. A Victorian parent transported to the modern day. He sees children playing freely, asking questions at the dinner table, refusing to eat certain foods. He sees laws forbidding him from punishing them with a strap or sending them to work. To him, this world seems indulgent, chaotic, and dangerous. The modern child appears spoiled, the modern parent weak. Each age judges the other harshly, revealing how much the concept of parenting depends on time and culture. This comparison highlights an important truth. Laws and norms evolve with society's understanding of childhood. What once seemed natural now seems cruel. What seems normal to us today may one day seem outdated to future generations. Parenting is not only personal, it is cultural, shaped by the values and fears of its time. In the next and final chapter, we will reflect on what these contrasts mean for us today. The story of Victorian parenting is not only a window into the past, but a mirror that asks us to consider how far we have come and how much further we still have to go. As we reach the end of this journey through Victorian parenting, it is worth pausing to reflect on what we have learned. The lives of Victorian children were shaped by discipline, labor, silence, and survival. Parents acted not out of cruelty alone, but out of the values, beliefs, and necessities of their time. Yet when we compare their practices to our own standards, the differences are stark. What they saw as duty, we see as neglect. What they called discipline, we call abuse. What they accepted as normal would today be illegal. The story of Victorian parenting reminds us that childhood itself is not a fixed idea. It is a cultural construct, one that changes with time, place, and society's understanding of what it means to grow up. In the 19th century, childhood was brief, fragile, and burdened with responsibilities. In the 21st century, childhood is longer, protected, and celebrated as a unique stage of life. The shift between these two worlds is not just about laws or customs, it is about how we value children as human beings. Consider again the central practices of Victorian parenting. Corporal punishment, once praised as the foundation of discipline, is now recognized as harmful. Child labor, once defended as education, is now banned as exploitation. Silence and obedience, once virtues, are now balanced with self-expression and dialogue. Dangerous medicines, once ordinary, are now crimes. Early marriage, once expected, is now condemned. Each of these changes reflects a broader transformation. Society has come to see children not as property, not as unfinished adults, but as individuals with rights, needs, and voices of their own. Yet this reflection also reminds us to be cautious in our judgments. It is easy to look back with outrage, to see Victorian parents as cruel or unloving. But most parents of that time acted within the limits of their knowledge and the pressures of their world. A poor mother who gave her baby laudanum to sleep was not malicious, she was desperate. A father who struck his son with a cane believed he was instilling virtue. They loved their children, but love was filtered through fear, tradition, and survival. Their mistakes were real, but they were mistakes of an age, not of individual hearts alone. The reforms that emerged in the late Victorian period remind us of another truth: change is possible. Writers, activists, and campaigners challenged practices once seen as unshakable. They argued that children deserved education, safety, and affection. Their voices reshaped laws and attitudes, laying the foundation for the protections we take for granted today. The fact that we can now look back and call Victorian parenting illegal is itself the result of their efforts. This history also invites us to reflect on our own time. Just as we judge the Victorians, future generations may judge us. What practices do we consider normal that may one day seem harmful? Are our children too burdened by screens, too pressured by competition, too neglected in the rush of modern life? Do we sometimes confuse providing materially with providing emotionally? The story of Victorian parenting is not only about them, it is also about us. It shows how parenting is shaped by culture, and how culture can blind us to the harm we cause. Another lesson is the importance of empathy. Victorian parents often withheld affection to protect themselves from grief, but the result was distance. Today, we know that children thrive on warmth, security, and love. Yet even now, parents sometimes struggle to balance discipline with compassion, authority with listening. The Victorian era warns us of the dangers of leaning too far toward control and forgetting the child's need for connection. Finally, this reflection matters because it honors the children themselves. Millions of Victorian children endured hunger, labor, silence, and fear. Their voices were rarely heard, their stories rarely told except through reformers or writers like Dickens. By looking back, by telling their story, we give them recognition they never received in their own time. We acknowledge their suffering and understand that the protections children enjoy today were bought, in part, by their hardships. To picture this closing reflection, imagine two scenes side by side. In one, a Victorian child sits at a long dinner table, silent, eyes down, trembling at the sound of his father's voice. In the other, a modern child sits at a kitchen table, laughing, asking questions, telling stories of their day. Both children are loved by their parents, but the expressions of that love could not be more different. One is bound by fear, the other is nurtured by freedom. This contrast captures the entire transformation of parenting across time. Or imagine a Victorian street, filled with children carrying bundles of matches, sweeping chimneys, or working in mills. Now picture a modern schoolyard, filled with children running, playing, and learning under the protection of laws that forbid exploitation. The difference is not only in the setting, but in the recognition that childhood itself has value, that it deserves to be protected for its own sake. The story of Victorian parenting, then, is not merely a tale of the past. It is a reminder of how far we have come, how fragile progress can be, and how important it is to continue protecting children in every age. The Victorians, for all their faults, also began the journey of reform. They opened the door to the idea that children matter. We are the inheritors of that idea, and it is our responsibility to carry it forward. As we close this exploration, one truth stands clear. What was once considered good parenting would now be illegal. And that is not only a judgment on the Victorians, it is a celebration of how much we have learned. Childhood is no longer a time of silence, fear, and labor. It is a time of growth, play, and love. That perhaps is the greatest progress of all.